Hello, everybody. This is your host, Aram Melkoumov, and you're listening to another episode of the Product Innovation Series, where every week, my guests share their stories and wisdom on how to ship a great product. So today, I'm joined with Jeffrey Greene. He's the Director of Product and Design at NinePatch. Previously, he was a UX and product designer most of his career and had completed his Master's of Architecture at Harvard. Jeff, pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Good to be here.
Awesome. Cool. Well, the first question I have is, when we went through your bio before, you come from more of a design background, which is great for this specific episode we're going to be talking about. But first question I have is early on in your career, you told us that you really wanted to be in the same room where decisions were being made. And so for the longest time, I think it's been changing more recently in the last few years, but designers weren't typically part of those conversations for different reasons at the time. But I wanted to ask, how did you get into those rooms eventually?
So yeah, a lot of times, especially some of the old school people, they think design is just sort of a coat of paint, at the end of the process, which we know isn't the case. And, Steve Jobs had a lot to do with saying design isn't how it looks, it's how it works. But, when you're the younger ones and there's, older school people, they have their own biases. So for me, I always thought you have to be in the room where the decisions are being made. Otherwise, you get it at the end of the relay race and you're like, oh man, why didn't they do this? Or why did they do that? So that was always something I just felt really early on. And honestly, I was probably in the beginning a bit naive and not really someone who thought about the politics in an office or something, and basically didn't really know when to keep my mouth shut. And sometimes that works, it's risky, so sometimes it might not. But you have to try and get on leadership's radar somehow, and hopefully if you have good ideas, you just try and figure out a way to get those heard in any venue possible. And hopefully there's at least one executive out there who's open to hearing things, right? And because you might have, people who are just worried about their own stuff or their own careers. And if that is the case, then that's probably not a company you should be at anyway. So to me, it was, taking a risk. And luckily, I had an executive who was open to hearing things. And there was sort of, after one launch, there was sort of a big kind of 15-person meeting about what happened and feedback. And I kind of opened my big mouth about a couple things. And the next meeting ended up being 3 of us. So the CEO liked what she heard. That was a risk, but she liked it. And she was like, you know what? You sound like, you have a sense of things. So it came down to me, her, and the CTO to figure out what sort of version 2 was going to be. So it's a risk, but you got to get on the radar. And if they're not receptive to that, that's probably not a good place for you to be anyway. So that could be a red flag too.
Oh, amazing. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And just in that example, and maybe other ones, you mentioned that there was an issue with a certain release or whatever it was, but I'm curious to know what was the message that was communicated at that time, or maybe in other occasions, that opened up their eyes and ears to what design thinking, or
right,
thinking about design early on at the very beginning stages.
So they'd done some focus groups and just got, pages and pages of feedback. And they were just sort of going down this list of 200 different things. I was like, oh, this button was in the right place, and they wanted to do this, and a whole lot of, some things were big, a lot of ticky-tacky things. And they were talking about, okay, well, let's prioritize them and da-da-da-da. And I kind of raised my hand and I said, it's yeah, we could sort of attack them one at a time. But this is sort of like if you had a wall and there was 100 different holes in it, do you spackle each one separately, or do you just rip it down and put up new drywall? So maybe going back to my architecture metaphors, and that resonated because we were going to just be spending a whole lot of time doing minor repairs. And at a certain point,
Right.
you know, if you buy a house, that's a fixer-upper. But if you find that it's too much, then you just tear it down and start new. And luckily, the CEO, she was sort of open to that thinking. And also it, you know, hopefully it, you know, practically it works because you're going to get a better outcome instead of renovating, you know, just put up something new. So I think that resonated. And luckily she was, you know, a good leader. And that's a big part of it also. You know, we can say all the good ideas in the world, but if you don't have a leader who's willing to take risks and things like that, then they don't go anywhere. So in that case, she was a great leader.
And what was like the next action item? Did you go back to the drawing board? Did you conduct the user testing or the user interviews a bit differently?
Yeah. So for that particular project, and this happens all the time, but before I came on, so this was a relatively new company, but they'd been around for maybe 9 months at that point, and they'd made certain decisions, mostly about their stack, that kind of hamstrung us a little bit. So this is about 2005, 2006. It was a very early movie download service. So it was Morgan Freeman, his production company, partnered with Intel. He's really into science and technology. And this is before iTunes was doing movies. You know, Netflix was still doing DVDs. So it was real early on. And so they made a decision really early to sort of build the stack on something called Ruby on Rails, because the idea was that would be able to power both the website version and a Windows Media Center, you know, TV interface. So they were really ambitious with trying to do that. But what unfortunately happened was we ended up with the worst of both worlds in the corresponding. So all the limitations of doing a remote control based interface on a television, we were stuck with that on the website, and then, you know, vice versa. So basically we ended up separating them and severing them and saying, you know what, it's not worth it. So let's just create a regular all HTML web app for the web version and not worry so much about having sort of a unified stack. And those are things, you know, certain decisions are made and some work out, some don't. But like I said, she was, you know, a good enough leader that she recognized that a mistake was made. So we ended up blasting out the web app version in like 7 weeks, because we had the freedom to do it, and it took no time, and there's no way we would have been able to do all the other 200 changes in that time anyway. So that ended up working okay.
Nice. Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for sharing that story. Next question I have is, you know, in a design role and like, you know, in different capacities, there's always that content or like the vision that is in a business pitch deck that gets put out to the stakeholders or to whoever it is, and then it actually making it to the actual design. From your experience, what's been the most difficult part of making, you know, a business pitch idea or a deck a reality?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest translations that I think we as product designers, I think are key to that process. And I think that's the skill set we have is to visualize ideas. And in a certain sense, I think good product designers are somewhat generalists, and we have to have a sense of business and business strategy, sense of marketing, you know, always be an advocate for the user and the customer, and then be able to translate that to the technical people and the engineers. So that I, you know, everyone always thinks that their job is the most important in the company. You know, marketing thinks they're important, or sales, or whoever. The difference is we're right, and we are the most important person in the company. Uh, but being able to take ideas and visualize them is a really important skill. The brain translates visual stuff 90,000 times faster than the written word. So that to me is sort of our secret weapon. And if we can do that and take, ideas, visualize them so that they can be communicated really well, that's where we sort of solidify our spot, in the food chain. And the problem, and that's why being in the room is so important, right? Because if we're not, then you get sort of this game of telephone that happens where, maybe the execs, had an idea about something, and then it goes to somebody else, and then somebody else, and then by the time the product people see it, who knows how many biases have been inserted into that. So having a sense of that whole process and being the one who's able to translate those things clearly and communicate visually, I think that's our secret weapon.
And so how do you actually, if we were to break that down, how do you do that? Where you take the ideas, you visualize them, as you said, but what kind of approaches do you take in order to make sure that you solution it out correctly? It's well thought out.
So I think it's you start with the why before you can get to the what, and then so the why is what's the problem statement? What are you trying to solve? What's the competitive landscape that's out there? Who else is doing this? Is this a market that's emerging? Is it a mature market? What are the benefits to solving those problems? So like what are the pain points, and then what's the value in solving those things? Prioritizing those. Who are the personas, that are using the product? And there's so much, what we call, user experience research, but I think calling it UX kind of minimizes it a little bit, because people put that in the design category, so sort of subliminally think that is later in the process. But to me, that's the real important discovery that needs to happen. And as a product person, I have sort of a template that I use that just has a whole lot of blanks. And if I'm presented with a new project, it's like, okay, what do you have so far? And I hear from, the executives, and I start filling in sort of my bingo card. And if some of those questions are answered well, awesome. If they have like really good biz dev people and that, then they've done that homework already, then that's great. And I don't have to go do that. If some of those questions are sort of ambiguously answered, or maybe not even, then that's something I can say, okay, cool. Here's a couple of questions I have, to sort of further the process. And then again, if you have a receptive audience, they're like, oh yeah, that is good to think about. And then once you start filling in those blanks, then it really, you start to get a good sense of, okay, what's the information architecture going to look like? What's, the UX flow is going to kind of look like? And one of the important things that I keep discovering is trying to think in terms of verbs is a very important thing. So as a product designer, a lot of times we think in nouns, and engineers, that all they think about is in nouns, right? I'm going to build this, I'm going to make this. And flipping that into thinking about verbs, like what's the user trying to accomplish? What are we trying to accomplish? Just using verbs instead of nouns when you describe what the system is, instead of saying, oh, here's the reporting module, here's the client identity module, whatever. It's like, oh, here's how you do this, is a good way to sort of translate between, what the execs might want, what the users might want. So verbs, that's always a really good way to try and, when you got to put the PowerPoint together, think about verbs.
That's interesting. I've never heard that before in all the conversations. Think more in verbs than nouns. I like that. Okay. I think you provided an example already before about that scenario with a distribution product. I'm curious to ask, through other experiences that you've had, were there any other examples where things didn't go exactly to plan? And that could be in discovery. It could be, towards the end of delivery. Were there any kind of standout moments that you're like, oh, we should have done that differently?
Nope, everything's always gone perfect. Always on time and under budget. So so that movie download one, was a really big one. And depending on when you come into a company, there's always going to be certain decisions, that have already been made. And technical debt, is just a bear, and figuring out how to deal with those things is really, really difficult. Because those are sort of the invisible things. And everybody wants to, add new features and, do redesigns and whatever. But if you have some kind of technical debt, you got to switch up your stack or, authentication systems or, anything like that. It's really, really hard because you got to put so much time and effort and resources into it. And it doesn't nobody can see a difference because it's sort of the under the hood stuff. So that's something always struggling with. One of the ways to try and, things just aren't ever going to be perfect. And my wife helps me on this, where I'd say like, oh, I don't want to feel like I don't want to lower expectations, right? It's like, okay, I want it to be great. I want it to be perfect. But I feel bad if I think that I'm lowering my expectations. And she said, don't think of it as lowering your expectations. Think of it as just having realistic expectations. So that always helps me, because you're just like, you know what, this is the hand we were dealt, and whatever I think, doesn't really matter, and nobody else really knows what's in my head. So let's all just try and do the best we can with the hand we got dealt. So just, from a mental health standpoint, sometimes that's even more important than, what the design is, like keeping yourself sane, and not freaking out about about what could have been. So that's sort of attitude wise, I think is an important thing to try and always keep in mind.
Yeah. Somebody said this to me, or I read it somewhere, is if you don't communicate expectations, then they're just thoughts.
Yeah.
when I heard that, I'm like, that's so true. And it's hard, especially building product. Like, there's so many things in your head and in my head when it comes to building up, the solutions that we create. But managing expectations across the board between like the team or the board or the leadership team it's hard.
Yeah. And differentiating between your internal expectations of like how great you want something to be, are usually going to be way higher than everybody else's. So sort of differentiating between, okay, well, these are my things that I'd like to do, but nobody else is expecting that. So, I shouldn't kill myself trying to do that. Like, make sure, okay, what are the real expectations out in the world? And then you don't have to be, waking up at 1:30 in the morning being like, oh God, I got all this stuff to do. It's like, try and relax.
Yeah. When we had a chance to connect last time, you said something which was really interesting, which I try to say to our own clients and things like that. But you mentioned if you do product discovery, I'm assuming, you would know at the end of it exactly what has to be accomplished. And then when you get into the designs, you iterate very quickly in terms of what you're doing, and you rarely go backwards. And I could really resonate with that thinking. And so I wanted to ask you, what processes, tools, or frameworks kind of help you get to the point of knowing exactly what you need to accomplish at the end of discovery? Yeah,
so kind of what we covered a little bit before, this, customer requirements document that over the years I've, sort of kept improving and making a template for. being able to go through that, and fill in those blanks and be like, okay, what's the problem statement? What's the value props? All those things, really, when you know those and you internalize those, and you get consensus on those from the other folks. So that's the other big thing, is not only are you trying to come up with all that, but you get agreement on those things. Then you then don't have people second guessing you in the design phase, saying like, oh, well, what about blah? And you can say, no, look, we agreed that these were the top 3 priorities we were trying to accomplish. And that gets back to, speaking in verbs. This is what we're trying to accomplish, and this is the order we're trying to do it. And then if you can get consensus on that, because what happens is, everyone wants to see a mock-up way too fast. And one of my biggest jobs, is always like pushing back on that, saying like, nope, we're not jumping to what it looks like yet, because then you have people start saying like, oh, well, why are you using that font? And, oh, I don't like that color. And those are completely irrelevant, to the real discussion. So if you can get consensus on the problem statement, the value propositions, the benefits, the order you want to attack them, then you're like, oh, then you're good, and because that's when you start moving backwards, when those things aren't agreed upon. Yep. So you get consensus, what you're going for, and then you can start doing, your information architecture analysis, your user experience analysis, creating sort of a pre-wireframe where it's verbs, on, like a list of, okay, what am I trying to accomplish on the launch screen? What am I trying to accomplish on this screen? Pushing the design part as far down the road as you possibly can. And if you've internalized all that stuff, then once you start putting things on the screen, in a prototype tool or something like that, you know what's working and what's not. And it's a lot of times it's better to be able to say no to your own designs, and you just keep iterating yourself. But once you get to something and you're like, okay, this is doing this is doing that, then those things are really solid. And then you can finally show that to somebody, and be pretty confident that it's accomplishing what you all agreed on, a month before.
Oh, interesting. I'm curious to ask, what are some things that people never ask you that you wish they did about product design or product management?
That's a really good one. So to me, all of that process that we just talked about, I just find absolutely fascinating. So if somebody ever said like, oh, hey, Jeffrey, can I see that mental model diagram that you were talking about? I would love it if somebody would ask me to actually see some of that analysis, because I think that's fascinating, and that's the transition from ideas to reality. And to me, mental models, building mental models of your users is huge, and it's something I try and keep up with over and over. And sometimes you're fudging it, but as much as possible, if you can really, you talk to users and interview them and stuff, and then you can create your own. But to me, that's one of the most fundamental points where an idea starts to become reality. So yeah, if somebody ever said like, hey, can I see that mental model you talk about all the time? I would love that. But nobody ever does.
Okay. Well, I might ask you for it at the end of this episode. Last question before we get into the fireside format. I wanted to ask you, I mean, you've been doing this now for a while. What are some core product design lessons or principles that you keep coming back to?
There's a few. I think it's product marketing tenet number 7. your ideas, while interesting, are irrelevant. That's always a good one. One of my own is the more complex the problem, the simpler the solution has to be. You can't chase complexity with complexity. So the more complicated something is, you have to really try and distill it down. So those are two that I've, in various, back when we used to work in offices, would have printed out and pinned up on my on my cubicle wall. Trying to think wrote one more down. No, I think those two were the big ones. I think the stuff we talked about with, the why, knowing the why before the what, and then the what before the how, and then the how before the when. Those are the hard things, because, like, we see a lot of times they want to know the when or the how
right.
first. So, like, the Ruby on Rails, they started with the how without really understanding, how it would affect the why and the what. So trying to sort of do things in that order, and always looping back and questioning, your executives is something that's really important. And, a lot of times might think you're a pain in the ass and not be happy talking to you. But like I said, hopefully somebody recognizes that that's important. So, yeah.
Okay. Awesome. All right. Let's jump into the fireside format. So question, answer. First question I have is, how do you ask better questions in product?
So I just read a book about method acting. So I think I'd seen an article about it, and it just seemed kind of interesting. But as I was reading it, I thought about how it applies to what we do. And, as you become more of a mature designer, at least for me, it's like early in your career, it's like, hey, look how clever I am, and look how cool these ideas are. And then it translates into more like trying to inhabit your users, and like, what are they? So when I was reading the method acting thing, I was like, you know what? That's actually an interesting parallel. So as far as getting better in as a product person, I'd almost say doing method acting of your users and really trying to inhabit what they do and what they're trying to do. Take your ego, out of the equation, and as much as possible. So the project I work on now is whole person care. So it's, a lot of our users are, people that work at food banks and, in mental health, and, very different mindset from me. So actually almost doing like a method acting exercise where you really try and inhabit who they are and what their mindset is, and look at it with those eyes. And that's something I'm have just now been thinking through. But, being a advocate for your user is the product person's biggest role. And I thought that was maybe an interesting sort of mechanism or exercise to try and do.
Oh, for sure. I think it's a very interesting take on trying to get into the shoes of your users. Never heard that one before. Next question I have is that over years, what have you become better saying no to?
Actually saying no to myself, to my own. So again, we say, the product person, we think we're, the hub of the whole place. And always trying to sort of like make the whole machine run smoother. So in doing that, so at a previous place, our implementation person, this great woman from South Carolina, former nurse, they were taking like 100 hours to implement a client, and it was just forever. And she's like, oh, it's taking so long. And we were talking, and because there's like 1,000 questions to say, like, okay, optional, required, hide this, show this. And I said, oh, well, maybe we can make sort of a little, CMS, content management system, that can have default settings, and then you can go down it and we can blah, blah. So I worked on that with her, and we created this nice thing. And my boss at the time said, you know what, I love that you're trying to, help the whole process, because that's going to help the company, but that's not your job. And you have to know where your boundaries are. Because again, as we're sort of generalists, we can help with marketing, we can help with, different things. So knowing where my boundaries are and setting up that next person as well as possible, but not spilling over and doing some of their work for them, is tough, because it's always like, hey, if somebody else doesn't do their job, we all suffer. So, okay, fine, I'll help out. So it was really saying no to myself, my own urge to be like, because we're all problem solvers, we like making stuff. So if marketing or whoever says like, oh, we got to do a such and such for a booth, be like, oh, sure, I'll help, but it's like, that's not really my job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, raising your hand and helping out. Yeah, it's tough. I get it. Don't want to cross too many boundaries, as you said, right? Okay. Next question I have is, if you could only spend 5 hours per week in product, what would you want to spend that time on?
Like this job, like in doing product.
Yeah, like if you were to really focus on what you would want to do in 5 hours, if you only had 5 hours a week, what would you want to spend your time on in product?
Making prototypes. Like,
okay,
I can tell when my nerves or my mood isn't great if I haven't actually gotten into Axure for a few days, and if I've been living in spreadsheets and Jira and just doing sort of management work. So I need to sort of make something tangible. So if I had to eliminate all that other stuff, I would keep Axure and get rid of everything else.
Okay, awesome. Any controversial views you hold in product?
In product. Well, I would say universal healthcare for what we do, but you're in Canada, so that's not controversial for you, but it is here, unfortunately. I don't know. I mean, maybe, what I've said about thinking that we're really the center, and, learning how to sort of trust the other team members, and you don't necessarily have to be in every single meeting. And, to us, we think it all has to manifest in the product. So we need to be in those conversations. But you definitely have to trust, the other people you're working with, and it's not just going to be your vision all the time. So as far as product goes, that generally that capitalism is a plague that's going to destroy us, maybe is a somewhat controversial take to some people.
That's funny. Okay. My next few questions are about personal kind of things. So what profession other than what you do now would you like to attempt? I
actually talked about this with my wife last night. So we've always, I love what I do. So this is actually a harder question to answer. But something we sort of only halfway joke about is having sort of a street food pub, like world street food pub, because she's an amazing cook and we make little snacky things and all different things all the time. And we're always like, oh, got to put this one on the menu, fried jalapeno, bison burger slider, or, he's got dumplings, or we love all different kinds of food and making things. And we've always thought having a little bar where it's just all like that. Street food snacks from around the world would be absolutely incredible.
I think that is an incredible idea. I don't think I've actually seen that before.
Yeah.
As a concept. Yeah. Okay. What is one or two of the most worthwhile investments you've made to help your career?
To help my career. I mean, maybe not feeling the pressure to have sort of a linear career. So after I got out of architecture school, I realized I didn't really want to be an architect because the culture of architecture is not great. You're supposed to go work for free, for a big name architect for a year, out of graduate school. So like people with masters are having to do unpaid internships, and that's a problem in journalism and in a Hollywood, yeah. And there was just something about that I just didn't want to participate in, and that this is a while ago. Now we understand that that then becomes sort of a self-selecting privilege where only the people that can afford to go work for no pay then make their way up the ladder. So there was always something that I just wasn't crazy about with that. So maybe like investing in not actually having a real job and exploring different things, not in sort of a corporate ladder. I was able to kind of live like that for a handful of years, which I think added to being able to feel empathy for users, like we were talking about. I came up through white guy, middle class, went to college. It's a very select group of demographic, and some of the other stuff that I did afterwards, I met lots of different kinds of people, punk rockers and rave people and people that sort of started their own things, and just learned a lot about the world, and that's probably something that in retrospect really helps with what I've ended up doing.
Okay. All right. Last question. Is there any one or two books that have greatly influenced what you do or who you are?
One or two dozen. Yeah. So I was looking at my bookshelf earlier. Edward Tufte, Visualization of Quantitative Information. Like that just struck something. That's like, first time you hear a Buzzcocks record or something. It was like, I saw that and I was like, what the heck? So that's like a Bible to me. Moving sort of further on into product, something like From Good to Great, by Jim Collins. And there's a book called In Pursuit of Elegance by Matthew May that I thought was really, really informative. So on the product side, definitely some of those. And then kind of like we were just talking about on the sort of being a human being side, reading about people who are not like you. So reading, William Faulkner, James Baldwin, autobiography of Malcolm X, Bell Hooks, any of those things that, like the method acting thing, where you can sort of see life through some other eyes, are really, really important. And there's not always a direct correlation to what you're doing, but I think in just sort of opening your brain, to other possibilities, and not thinking that your way of thinking about the world is the right way or the only way is something that's really important. So reading books about other people's experiences or, it just makes you generally a better human in general, but it also does, I think, make you a better product person as well.
Amazing. Jeff, this was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.